when you think about the way businesses are organized now and how much time we as employees spend in browsers, or how much work we outsource to, where we're sending files over the internet or uploading data, that sort of thing, it's transitory. And not unlike olden days when we were most vulnerable when we traveled across the Wild West and we needed a guy with a shotgun next to us, there's that reality to this sort of vulnerability that exists. And that vulnerability is constant. It's 24 hours a day. It's very easy to feel you're secure. If the tool exists, we're going to use it. The fact that there isn't the obvious downside to that kind of behavior early on is a problem. And there were early examples of it that got leaked out of, banks and stuff, of people putting in drafts of contracts into ChatGPT and that sort of thing. And that is, again, not good for business. In short term, it's great, but that's the problem, right? Where short-term thinking is what creates long-term problems. There are lessons that we can take and we can make now better. So we can make more money by being slightly more cautious, or spending a little more money to be prepared for a problem, being adaptable. That's where I think that, having a more holistic approach to it and being aware of it isn't about scaring people into a Luddite back into the cave and a fire. It's about, you put your seatbelt on the car. When you buy a car, you think, does it have airbags? Oh, it's got more. It's got window airbags. That sort of mentality about personal security and personal safety exists.
Today, we're joined by Martin Hinton, an award-winning journalist and executive producer with over 30 years of experience. From his early days at Fox News and launching its first investigative unit, Martin has been creating high-profile content across video, print, and digital media. Now, Martin is podcast host and executive editor of Cyber Insurance News and Information, and runs his own media company, Rhetorical Ronin. Thanks for joining me on the Be Fearless podcast, Martin.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about your background, career journey. You've had an incredible 30-year journey from producing network news magazines like Fox Files to now covering cybersecurity insurance. What sparked your transition from traditional investigative journalism into cybersecurity?
So the cybersecurity part of it is driven largely by, it's a part of Rhetorical Ronin. And the idea we had, because I have two partners in that endeavor, was that this is a very specialized and fast-growing element of the insurance business. And from a media point of view, elements of industries like that often have bespoke news sources that don't have enormous audiences, but have the right audience, if you will, the right audience for advertisers or live and or digitally streamed events and that sort of thing. So it largely started from hey, this is a fast-growing part of the insurance business. Cybersecurity is a huge part of sort of the global economy. And there aren't a lot of dedicated news sources. So going back a couple of years now, part of what I did with my time was sort of lean hard into trying to understand it, shall we say.
Yeah, I think it's very confusing to a lot of people, cybersecurity insurance. Having been on the purchasing side several times and having different companies have different kinds of approaches to cybersecurity insurance, I think has been enlightening to me just to kind of understand how companies view risk and how they view their, cybersecurity programs, and then what is it that they're willing to insure and what they're not willing to insure. I think there's a lot of nuances in the process. And I think finding information about it, especially information across, like what kind of insurance is available, right? And how that's going to play out and how much coverage you're going to need, et cetera. I don't think there's a lot of information on how best to, structure cybersecurity insurance.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really, really good point. The first thing I realized very early on is I had to back up and I had to learn about the insurance industry as a global enterprise before cyber insurance. And I think that, when we do moving it to a personal level, say our homeowners insurance, it's a once a year conversation. You review what's covered and it goes up a tiny bit or maybe even more than a tiny bit, depending on where you are and that sort of thing. And with cyber, it's much more active. And you hear that phrase used, and there's actually companies that have branded the idea of having active insurance, where it's, the threats are so rapidly evolving and AI pops up in the middle of the year and you can't just sit on whether or not your policy covers this, that, or the other thing. And I think that that's one of the things that makes it more complicated. I also think, and this is a new idea that I've just started to work with, I think because it's insurance, that's a dirty word for a lot of people spending money. We have particularly coming out of the American environment with regard to health insurance, there is a real negative stigma to spend money on something you hope you're never going to need. Right. So, you don't really think about the spare tire in your car. It's there and you can only go 55. Insurance has a very different connotation. And I think that that's one of the real adoption issues that cyber faces. It's yet another expense that you wish you didn't have and you hope you don't need, but you need the resilience. So that headwind is there. Again, like I said, I'm just starting to sort of talk to people about that idea, but it is something I've thought about recently quite a bit.
For sure. In some ways, from a cyber, kind of thinking about it from a CISO perspective, right, is that when we get into the conversations about insurance, it kind of makes you feel like, other people don't have faith in you, right? That, you need insurance because there's not enough faith in your, cyber organization, your IT organization, or whatever. Maybe things aren't all okay, or kind of has that kind of feeling, kind of the negative connotation about it, I guess.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, the only thing I'd say about that is that when you think about the way businesses are organized now and how much time we as employees spend in browsers, or how much work we outsource to, where we're sending files over the internet or uploading data, that sort of thing, it's transitory, and not unlike olden days when we were most vulnerable when we traveled across the Wild West and we needed a guy with a shotgun next to us. There's that reality to this sort of vulnerability that exists. And that vulnerability is constant. It's 24 hours a day. And I think that, it's very easy to feel you're secure, but you have car insurance and you may never need it. And I think that that's another way to think about it, is there is this, it's an element of resilience. I don't want to sound too much of an evangelist. I'm not paid by any insurance companies to say what I'm saying, but that idea that there is, particularly now with how dynamic the threats are, and how broad they are, and they're nation state backed, and there are no barriers with regard to geography to where your enemy or your adversary could be coming from. It's not like burglary or fire or flood. It's a very different danger. And I think that that's another part of what makes it hard for CISOs, and we see this in a lot of the reports we read and interviews we do. It makes it hard to communicate that to a C-suite that's already got a full plate to deal with. You've got this new sort of threat, and new problems often have to be bad before they're truly addressed, and that's a human condition, not an issue with any particular moment in time now.
Right. Good points. I think I do want to get your point of view on why is cybersecurity insurance important, right? And we're talking about it, but anything else you want to add to it, or?
Well, I would say that, it's very easy for us to look at technology now. I mean, I'm 54, so I existed it's a Gen X. So I existed pre-internet. In the 80s, I went to computer camp and we learned to code in Pascal and BASIC and that sort of thing. And then I remember the first time I paid my rent, or I paid my roommate to pay rent online at Citibank, and you did the transfer on their nascent online banking platform, and he didn't get the money right away, so I called the customer service line and said, "Hey, how do I tell whether it actually worked?" And the woman on the phone said, "I don't actually know. We just introduced this. They haven't really told us how to deal with any inquiries about it." And I think that even though that's going back 30 plus years or so now, we are really, really in the sort of beginnings of the digital reality, or the tech reality, or the information age, or the technical age. And when you look at other evolutions like the industrial age and inventions that came along that made that, transformative, it's always the moment you think, oh, this is the big new thing. Well, there's a lot of big new things. And I think AI is the most recent thing to land in our laps in the last 2 years that has completely changed the way we think about business and how it's conducted and the economy. So I think that that's one of the things that you need to remember. It's a lot like the Wild West, right? Right after the Civil War in America, you had this sort of transformative moment in America where the West was being sort of established, if you will, as it is now. And banks didn't have safes, and we had gangs with cool names, and they were robbing trains and banks, and they used dynamite. And that all sounds kind of familiar to the cool names that ransomware gangs and other cyber criminals have now. So I think we're at the very beginning of this, and the idea that there is a way to know what the problem is foolish. It's I don't like to use the warfare analogies, but your plan for cybersecurity, to your point about CISOs feeling like maybe they're going to be viewed as not having a good plan or a good tech involved in their company's cybersecurity. In some respects, a war going on between adversaries here. And in warfare, all plans only survive contact, and they constantly need to be evolved and adapted for the moment and the day and the new threat, the weather, whatever it might be. And I think that mindset that it's always going to be, it's like staying healthy. You got to have a good routine. You can't just diet a few times a year and get the weight to where you want it to be and then blow up over the next. That's just not healthy. You have to have a much more holistic, constant, consistent approach to it.
Sure. And I guess, I think in enterprises in particular, the ability for us to change the environment to react to cybersecurity threats that are evolving is not as quick as you would expect it to be, right? If you do have a new threat, we'll talk about AI here in a second, but when you have a new threat, your ability to react to is going to be based on what tools you have available to you right then, and then what you can do with those tools at that time. Because anything else that you do is going to have procurement, legal, evaluations of those technology products, and that takes time, as opposed to the barrier of entry for a hacker is actually a pretty low bar of entry. If they have a computer, they have connectivity, they can be a hacker. And it's really just a matter of how ingenious they're going to be and what they can find on the internet. And they're not opposed to stealing or piracy to get software that they need. And there's plenty of materials for them to kind of learn what's going on. And then they can just launch attacks, right? So it's a kind of different. The asymmetry is real, and it's about fast evolving threats versus monolithic, slow processes, and how to best as an enterprise, because it's not really about the CISO, it's really about the enterprise and what they're trying to do. How best do they hedge their technology risk by using cybersecurity insurance? And cybersecurity insurance is a tool for them to use to hedge their technology risk, operating in an environment with asymmetries.
I think you just, whether you intended to, you just evangelize for cyber insurance, because the truth of the matter is, and it's a dirty word now, bureaucracy, but large enterprise corporations have to exist in a place where they do spending that's limited month to month or quarter to quarter. And if suddenly a new expense lands, you can't just throw money at every problem. That's just not a good way to run, particularly a publicly traded company. And I think that that's where cyber insurance sort of fills that the dynamism gap that doesn't exist at a lot of large corporations, despite their willingness to say that they're dynamic. They're just not. Large corporations are designed, and if you look at the S&P 500, there's a reason they're designed the way they are, and it's largely very effective, but it does come with flaws. And I think reacting to things in the short term, particularly big threats, and Marks and Spencer's is the hack in the UK against the retail chain Marks and Spencer's is one I look at, and I really think is going to become a case study, is an example of that. But it is very, very true. It's, and the adversary knows this. They know these companies are slow to react. And we see this, that attacks spike at times when we're distracted, where we're coming into a holiday season, or there's more people on vacation, or a 3-day weekend. The Lunar New Year is another, when in Asia, you see a spike in hacking activity in those periods of time when people are distracted. And companies don't have everyone around. We can't get Jimmy on the phone. He's on a plane, and Susan's she's on a boat. It's going to be about an hour before we can get her. That hour is golden time.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've been in that situation so many times that attacks happen when your folks are away, right? Or even not even the cyber folks. It's like you need a decision from an executive to make to do something, and they're unavailable as well. So it's again, it's cyber's a team sport, need everyone to, play their part, I guess, right? Tell me about Marks and Spencer and that attack, and
sure,
and how you feel like it's going to be a case study. I'm very interested in hearing.
Yeah, so it's Marks and Spencer's, for those who don't know, is a massive legacy retailer in the UK. I think it's been around 150, give or take, years. So it's an old company, and now it is a modern retailer on the level of something like Target or Walmart, in the sense that you can go into Marks and Spencer's and you can buy groceries and get a cashmere sweater. It's one of those places. And I was born in the UK in London, so I'm familiar with it as a child. They experienced a hack back in April, and they had an absolute shutdown of operation. I think that their stock price dipped close to $2 billion. It's a publicly traded company. I think they've estimated so far that the cost of lost business is going to approach £300 million. So depending on the exchange rate, I'll leave the viewers to do their own math. But what's really interesting is that the scale of the attack was so great that the chairman, Archie Norman, testified before Parliament, and it was really a case study in comms communication. And he is a very, very experienced businessman, also had been a member of Parliament. And he just talked about how they have 50,000 employees, from people in Manchester, England, working a retail store, to back-end workers in India. All of those points of entry into the company represent threat vectors, or whatever the lingo is supposed to be. And I think that he also talked about how it's an old company. So you have layered tech stack, right? So there's a lot of legacy processes and equipment that, don't get updated because that's expensive. And retail is a thin margin business to begin with. And he talked about having increased their cyber insurance and increased their cybersecurity team. Does he wish he'd done more? Of course he does. But it seemed like he was saying there was no argument to do it. The fast forward to 3 or 4 weeks ago, and they only just reinitiated the buy online and pick up the store feature of their business. So it was a devastating attack. There were other companies involved, but the Marks and Spencer one is the one that really rings true for me. That is, I think an example of, the vulnerability that exists in the way they do business and the nature of the structure of their business. So that's sort of the stuff that I think is really interesting about it.
Yeah, for sure. I guess people don't really realize it, like from the outside, looking into a company, how complicated, I'm going to say legacy businesses. It doesn't really matter. And what I mean by legacy businesses is that, let's say a company that's over 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, and you get into 50 and 100 years old and 150 years old, that the culture and the people and the processes, they're very set, right? And then you add technology to it. And the technology is often fast moving, right? And then you have these kind of arcs where even if you had an innovative company, you would have an architecture for that innovation that you were going to go do, but that you also had all the previous attempts at some other architecture, and you have just these layers and layers and layers of technical debt or legacy debt that oftentimes, especially in manufacturing or physical operations, where cyber physical kind of problems start to occur, that sometimes you can't even get those systems updated anymore. The manufacturer of that system may not even exist, or if they do exist, they're not supporting that version of something. Which in IT and in cyber, we're always kind of pushing into new technology. Right. So your hardware goes out of support, and then that requires you to go to a new piece of hardware that requires an operating system, because the operating system that you were using isn't supported on this new piece of hardware. And that operating system makes your database have to be updated. And all these pieces and parts are kind of all moving in motion while you're trying to secure what you think is a business process or a way of going to business. And all of these things are just different attack surfaces that are constantly in change, right? And often we don't understand the new technology as well as we understood the older technology that we'd been, keeping up to date for, 3 years, 5 years. We understand that technology now, but we're being forced to move, and there's just going to be gaps, right? And in a lot of ways, I think companies, that attack surface is very complicated, right? And those opportunities for a hacker to find seams in your defense that allow them to attack your company, Marks and Spencer, hit a ransomware event, those kinds of things, take out operations. That's a very complicated landscape. You have 50,000 employees. You have so many, systems that are available that may have connectivity back to the environment, back into your back end system stuff. It's very complicated to defend.
You touch on something that I think is, because for me as a journalist, I'm not a tech person, and I've been at this a couple of years, but you touch on a reality of human nature. We don't subtract to fix things. We add things. And I think when we add things, we don't comprehend that that's not going to solve the problem without creating new problems. And I think that you also touched on the idea that in business, friction is a problem. That's that famous Steve Jobs line. And if you're in a customer service business, friction slows sales and it frustrates customers, and there's somewhere else for them to go now, right? And I think that all of that plays into the hand of the bad actor, the cyber criminal, in a way that probably not being addressed at the level it should be. I have rather sort of doomsday-ish perspective about how bad it's not a zero-day event, but a catastrophic sort of cyber attack against things along the lines of the CDK attack that made it impossible to buy a car in America, where you just couldn't process the paperwork to buy a car in America and I think it was like 7+ days. That's fine. But what if it's something serious like a hospital chain or a hospital system? That's where I think that, we are maybe keeping our heads in the sand a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the cybersecurity industry doesn't, as a whole, right, from the, the seller side, like selling product, we tend to target the Fortune 100, Fortune 50 kind of companies because they have a lot of money to spend on cyber stuff, and our products become expensive so that we can capture value. But then there's so many small and medium-sized businesses, and I was just talking to someone a couple of weeks ago about a hospital in Virginia that got hacked by ransomware, and they lost all the everything that they needed to support I think they had like 700 people living at this hospital, and all of their records, all their electronic records were no longer available. So they had to go back to paper. And fortunately, they were tracking stuff on paper as well. But when people were asking like, hey, what do I need? They had to go back to paper to kind of say what's happened. And I think that's because the entry of, having cyber skills available, having, the technology to support those systems, and the people that have the expertise to run those systems, and the people that have the expertise to analyze those systems, those are expensive resources just because of supply and demand. And it makes it very difficult for I think most businesses in the U.S. and probably the rest of the world as well to defend well, right? And so,
yeah. I mean, I did an op-ed piece for our site, and it analyzed. We looked at K through 12 school systems, and the point I made was, should we be considering these critical infrastructure given the role they play not only in educating the next generation of adults, but also in the role they play taking care of children during the day while parents work now. And the idea that a school could shut down, or, you could find records about some 10-year-old's mental health treatment because their parents are going through a divorce, and you hold on to that for 30 years. And when they're running for Congress or the CEO of a company, it becomes real fodder to attack them and demand money for silence. And I think that that's where the complex part of this it's hard. You see these data breaches, 160 billion of this, logons, whatever, credentials stolen. And it's a lot like most people view the internet. Or as Senator Stevens from Alaska famously once said, it's a bunch of tubes that information go through, which I always thought was a really good analogy, frankly. But it is this sort of abstract thing for a lot of people, how all of this tech works, how you and I are seeing and talking to each other I'm in Ireland right now. And I think that for a lot of people, it's the classic line is, if the world ended tomorrow and I was the only one left, the list of things that wouldn't exist would be very, very long. And I think that that's where the understanding from a point of a CISO or a journalist is really, really important, to make it clear to people that these things do and can matter to you in very, very real ways. It can make your wait at the hospital longer. It can delay your purchase of a car that you need to get to work. These are very real human issues that I think often get detached from it because the word cyber does this thing to our brains, and it makes us think that it's, again, like, there's so many acronyms. Don't get me started on the acronyms.
Yeah. No, but I think you're right. I think when someone says here cyber, they think I won't understand it, and they kind of turn it off, right?
Yeah.
And I've seen that many times. And I think that, kind of in that space, it's just kind of like going back to like AI and generative AI in particular. We're just starting on this innovation train, right? We're 2 years into this world. I was reading some research, some MIT research, where they're talking about how businesses are trying to, introduce AI and Gen AI into their systems, and that 95% of them fail. Right?
Yeah. I just did. There's a new report out today that they're implementing AI without any real guardrails. There's the shadow AI problem, and this is a phenomenon, right? The new thing. It started when Zuckerberg laid off a bunch of people at Facebook, and every CEO thought, "Oh, I got to fire a few thousand people to make it look like I'm avant-garde and on the cutting edge of how businesses should be run these days." And AI is the new thing. But to your point about its nascent reality, the analogy I use is we are in the Model T Ford days of AI. So you can imagine a car now with sat nav and automated driving and whatever it might be, 1,000 horsepower. We are at the very, very beginning of this. It's a lot like the steam engine at the beginning of the industrial age, this very, very basic way to turn work into something people didn't have to do. And I think that it's very, very hard for anyone to see into the future. And goodness knows whether AI can sustain the spending that it's doing and all that sort of thing. But the decision makers have clearly leaned in on it being part of the future of our world and our economy and our lives and our cultures. And I think that the consequence of that is one that is being pushed aside like often happens, and we'll only find out in the future. There's no such thing as hindsight before. So.
Absolutely. I think that your Model T analogy is a great analogy. One is because, the Model T, as useful as it was at that time, I think people would have considered it expensive, right? And two, it was also unsafe, right? It wasn't a safe mode of transportation, right?
Yeah. So just sorry to interrupt, but you make a great point. The timeline of car improvement is history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. We didn't introduce airbags and seatbelts until I was alive, right? That's not that recently. So in the history of the automobile, the slowly steady progression of improvements like anti-lock brakes, windshield wipers, that didn't exist in the beginning. And that's the way to think about how AI is going to be adapted. These tiny little improvements and the way it's utilized by specific industries or individuals, that's going to be how it transforms us if it survives its infancy. I guess it's still in the crib, I guess you could say.
I definitely believe it's going to survive, right?
Me too.
I think that the kind of continuing on the the analogy is that there's no guardrails for it. There's no airbags.
Yeah, airbags. Yeah.
No crash tests on this. Right.
No,
no one's done any crash tests to say, hey, is the structural integrity of this vehicle going to be working? None of that's true in AI, right?
But I have to say, this isn't a new problem. We know that the dangers of cigarettes were ignored. We know we're going to find out that the dangers of social media were ignored, right? We're seeing this now. There's money to be made, and this. I'm not knocking capitalism, and this is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there are consequences to progress that we often ignore because we're chasing the gold.
Yeah, well, I think that and then the timeline for regulations is, decades in the making, right? Like you said, we're just starting to see legal consequences for social media companies at all. Like they're even showing up in courts and stuff has been a long time, to get to that point. And that's just the nature of legal systems and against innovative technology. Again, there's an asymmetry in how fast you can move on technology versus how fast laws can be deployed and regulations can be deployed and cases can be done. I think it's just going to take a long time to get to the point where all of this stuff kind of feels safe, but we're probably on a 20-year journey for that is what I'm thinking. But going to that point, just like for listeners, for CISOs, and for people that are listening to us about cybersecurity insurance, one, right? Like it's like, hey, why do you want to hedge your bets? Because there is an asymmetry between how fast and technology innovates and how people are using it. But one of those places is going back to the MIT study. It's like 95% of those investments that are made to have an ROI are failing, but where they're seeing uptick is in just general productivity across the board with people using Copilot, ChatGPT, or Claude or whatever in their environments. That's good, but there's also the rise of shadow AI, right? There's lots of people that in this study, they said that 90% of the people that they surveyed were using AI at work. But only 60% of the companies or 40% of the companies, one of those numbers, were actually had bought something for their users to use, right?
Yeah. So imagine you're at a company, let's say take a media company, a contracting industry, legacy media is, laying people off. Disney's an example. And you're suddenly a third of the staff is no longer there. And all of the same amount of work still has to happen. Right? You're going to take proprietary information and you're going to get your job done. And you're going to put proprietary information in a place like an AI, LLM, and it's no longer proprietary. You've just shared, and it could be innocuous, but death by 1,000 cuts comes to mind as a cliche here. Right? If you take transcripts of an interview and you put them into a chatbot, you are now giving up all of that stuff that your company might have spent tens of thousands of dollars in salary and time to hire camera crews to go and get. And I think that that's where you have to remember that, if it's 4:00 on a Friday and you've got a 6:30 bus to get to your weekend away, you have a task to finish. Americans can, right? Americans do things. People do. We achieve. We solve problems. And if the tool exists, we're going to use it. And I think that the fact that there isn't the obvious downside to that kind of behavior early on is a problem. And there were early examples of it that got leaked out of, at banks and stuff, of people putting in drafts of contracts into ChatGPT and that sort of thing. And that is, again, not good for business. In short term, it's great, but that's the problem, right? Where short-term thinking is what creates long-term problems.
Right. Well, I mean, we often talk about that in, the stock market, right? It's like the monthly, quarterly kind of cadences of things cause, shortcuts to be made. And I think that happens with productivity as well. And, shadow AI is a big problem. I did a webinar a few months ago on Gen AI and protecting Gen AI. And one of the things that I was discussing was shadow AI and how many companies are out there. At the time, there were like 2,000 plus, AI startups, and there's tens of thousands of extensions available in your Chrome browser to go and get Gen AI added to your Chrome browser, or your browser, or whatever browser you use. But I think that the bigger problem is just that, the companies just don't have that visibility. All of a sudden something's, and it's not new. We've been on this journey of going to cloud, having SaaS companies build new products for us, improvements in the browsers. And then those are just kind of drive innovation cycles where people are putting their IT out on SaaS companies. And then the SaaS companies want people to adopt them. So they make it incredibly easy for you to sign in with Google or sign in with Microsoft and adopt new technologies without anyone in your IT organization and anyone in your cybersecurity organization to know. Yeah. And they're using it to get work done, but there's a trade-off, right? You got productivity increasing, but you have this trade-off of, where your data is and where it's being used. Right?
Yeah. I read a piece this morning about a new method for hacking where within an image you might take off the internet, embedded is hidden words. You upload that to a chatbot or whatever it might be, and those instructions hidden in the image give the chatbot or the hacker access to your Google Drive, for example. So
you prompt injections and yeah, but again, all of those are risks that you have in the business just because of the innovation of technology, what's going on in the world. And of course, we have technology that helps secure that. But we talked about, it's slow to kind of get those technologies deployed, understand those technologies to get them out there. With respect to that, this attack surface and shadow AI, has this changed the way you think about cyber insurance? I mean, are companies concerned about it? Are insurers concerned about it?
It seems to me there is a lot of concern and a lot of uncertainty about how to proceed. And I think the economic concerns that exist in America now with talk of a recession obviously aren't going to help spending on problems that haven't actually done you a lot of damage yet. But I harken back to like the property and casualty origins of insurance when, this is a bit of a joke, but an insurer might come to a warehouse and be like, I'd like to insure you, but let me tell you about this thing called sprinkler systems first. And here's a guy, I'll put one in for you and I can get you a 20% discount on that and it'll reduce your premium 20% as well. So it'll pay for itself in 2 years or whatever it is. And I think that there is, you see this now with particularly some of the newer insurance companies. There's a company called Coalition, which is the first time I encountered this, where they use the phrase active insurance, and the idea that the insurer is also the security guard. There's this idea that you bring them in, and there is, and I know that there are companies that do this, and there are more acronyms than I can think of off the top of my head. But that idea that you need this more hand-in-hand approach, at least for the moment, is something that is probably another barrier for adoption in cyber insurance, because most of the time it's, we've got this insurance policy, or we self-insure and we renew it every year and we know what it's going to cover. And every now and then we might add something to it or subtract something to it. But that idea is that, there is a very, very different dynamism to this threat, and I've said that before. But it is something that I think it's tough. It's really, really hard. It's like doing the 70-day workout challenge or whatever it was called, where you work out twice a day, but you can't stop for now. You have to stay on top of it. And it's a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week reality, because the threats are coming from other parts of the world, and they're nation state backed for the purposes, say, in North Korea, of generating hard currency. I mean, the fake IT worker stuff that's gone on it's mind-boggling what you can do now. And I think that's where even it's hard to comprehend the idea that you can sit in front of this, and I could be a 15-year-old girl sitting here, and I could look like I do now and sound like I do now, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And I think that's almost hard for me to comprehend, having even seen demos and met CEOs at identity governance companies and tech companies and stuff like that, and they explain it to you, and you still think, how is that? It's really, really abstract in some ways. And I think, again, that really hurts the ability of people to understand the threat.
Well, I've never had a 15-year-old girl talk to me about cyber insurance, so.
Well, I'm not. I probably shouldn't use that example in this day and age, but I was trying to be as opposite of myself as I could be.
Absolutely. Well, I imagine that, the actuaries, like you were saying, haven't quite figured out what to make of Gen AI yet, because the losses haven't come in yet to figure out like what's it going to be. And has it really changed the nature of breaches from most of the stuff that we're talking about with respect to losses are typically insider threats, internal threats, where people are taking documents from inside, sticking into whatever, and then trying to be more productive. There's definitely the conversation, you're like stenography and putting prompt injections inside an image and trying to use that to circumvent controls that might be in that LLM.
Yeah. Back to the Marks and Spencer hack, the phrase used by the chairman in his testimony before Parliament was sophisticated impersonation. And I interpreted that as deepfake. You've got examples where you mentioned the insider threat. The insider might be someone you hired, you verified their identity once 18 months ago when you onboarded them, and they're remote workers, and that's, they're not actually where they say they are. I mean, there was a woman arrested and indicted in Arizona, I think it was, for running a laptop farm, and it was all designed to spoof the geolocation of the workers. So again, I think that it's, again, the idea that a North Korean could apply for a job for an American company, appear American, provide all the necessary checks that they have requirements for in the moment, and get that job and be working 3 jobs like that from Pyongyang is like, it's the stuff of sci-fi. And I think that, it is, again, hard to imagine that that's true. I mean, I have a sneaky suspicion that one of the big pushes for the end of remote work at large financial institutions is driven by concern that people aren't who they say they are. And they want people to be in the office more frequently so that they can literally eyeball them and require them to tap a sort of, physical ID on a turnstile. And they obviously don't want to say that, because banks have always been very, very sort of coy about how much fraud exists around credit cards and that sort of thing, because the money they make off it is worth the loss that they endure when someone, we used to think that the signature on the back of your credit card was somehow secure your card from being used by someone other than you. And it's just, looking back at it, silly. And I think we're going to look back at some of the stuff we do now and think, well, that was silly. But again, hindsight's a very, very a hill with a very good view. So
absolutely. I think that it is interesting how the internet has changed how people can defraud someone else, right? And I think that's another one of those problems that, with great power comes great responsibility, in a way where, we have the internet. The risk reward is, I feel, still the thing that as a society, we get way more reward from connectivity and the internet and everything else. I mean, the amount of GDP that's produced just by people being connected is incredible, and that growth has got to be a hockey stick as well, right? Yeah. So it's definitely don't want to turn back the clock to when you.
No, you make a very good point. That whenever I'm asked about this, this is more, being a sort of student of history and having done a lot of work in the history and the military history space and documentaries and that sort of thing. There are lessons that we can take and we can make now better. So we can make more money by being slightly more cautious or spending a little more money to be prepared for a problem, being adaptable. And I think that that's where I think that, having a more holistic approach to it and being aware of it isn't about scaring people into the Luddite back into the cave and the fire.
Right.
It's about, you put your seatbelt on in the car. When you buy a car, you think, oh, does it have airbags? Oh, it's got more. It's got window airbags. That sort of mentality about personal security and personal safety exists. You look both ways when you cross the street. And we almost need a more, again, I keep using the word holistic because we are in the digital space, right? We live in this world. It's not going anywhere. The idea that when we teach children about online safety, it's all about how to not get involved with a predator or get involved in something involving sex. And I think that should probably be much, much broader, because when you look at the amount of money stolen from seniors now as a function of their wealth, it's extraordinary. And I think there is a great burden on us to protect people who are vulnerable. And I also think that it's bad for business for money to just get stolen by someone who didn't earn it.
No, absolutely. Well, I think definitely more education, especially in the U.S. I don't think we have enough education on cyber. Everyone's part of the digital economy now, whether they want to be or they don't want to be. And at my son's school, I think we could, definitely could increase the cyber education, right? Because awareness does matter. You be in that last line of defense before someone defrauds you or takes advantage of you online. You got to be making good critical thinking kind of skills about what's happening. And if it's too good to be true, then it probably is. How to be thinking about when you start feeling a sense of urgency when you're reading an email or a text or something. Should you be having that feeling of urgency? And if you are,
the cyber criminals have all the benefit of everything we know about behavioral psychology, all the tools used by supermarkets and stores to make us buy those things at the last minute as we check out, or how they lay out us. All that exists for bad actors, and it's being utilized very, very effectively. I mean, the street level con has existed for a long, long time, but the same tactics that make you feel like this is a moment you can't pass up, and I got to do this now, it's incredible how easy it is for you to fall into that sort of space. And it's a bit like a magician or an illusionist making you think they can actually perform magic. You would never think that wasn't possible based on what you saw with your own eyes. And here we are again. Our senses aren't tuned enough for the threat in this space.
Absolutely. Whether that's deep fakes or you're talking to a chatbot or whatever, it's, we were like, I was going to say that we were talking about browser AI agents in a seminar a month ago or so. And it's the same thing where people are going to use these tools for productivity gains. And it's that browser agent is not, going back to we're at the beginning of this, and there's not a lot of guardrails, these haven't been crash tested. And folks are asking technology to do things automatically for them without any kind of guardrails, because those AI agents are not trained at all on understanding security or understanding like what's happening. And human in the loop seems to be something that you really want to have right now.
I feel very personally strong about this, that whatever exists in the world is a function of, say, your business. There needs to be a person responsible for it. So if it doesn't do the right thing or it doesn't work properly, there needs to be a human being who goes, oh, well, that was my fault. We designed that wrong. Or whether it's the CEO or someone who actually made a mistake and didn't say anything about it. I think that's really like an underlying part of tech that needs to be, maybe part of the foundation of all of the future. Like people matter most. It's all of it's for our benefit and the planet's benefit broadly, right? And if we're doing things that are detrimental to human beings, then I'm a little bit concerned that what's the point of that? I mean, I know we can, but should we? No, I
agree. 100% agree with you. 100% agree. It is definitely supposed to be for our benefit, right? So,
yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about leadership. You're running Rhetorical Ronin LLC. Mm-hmm. While also serving as executive editor. How do you balance the entrepreneurial side with the editorial responsibilities?
Well, the practical part of it is that I am an empty nester. I'm in Ireland because one of my kids works in Dublin and the other is in university here, and we're just here to move him back in. My mother was Irish. And so I think that there's a lot more free time. My wife's a New York City residential real estate broker, so she works a lot of weekends. So there's a lot of time to read and to write and to look over things and that sort of stuff. a huge part of the workload now is a lot of the video, and I use a podcast app. There's a lot of AI there that really, really limits the amount of work that would have to been done by a second person once upon a time, which I have mixed feelings about. And I think that what's really interesting is that the cyber insurance website and cyber insurance security website is a part of Rhetorical Ronin. To give you a sense of the spectrum we're on, we launched, and we're sort of trying to figure out how to make it work, a YouTube channel recently that's dedicated to a TV show idea we have called World's Smartest Dog. So we're really all over the map. I work with two people who are, like me, been in the journalism business and the television business and the media business for decades. I think we have a combined 100 plus years experience. And we have documentary ideas about a man who owns a barbecue restaurant in Hackensack, New Jersey, who in the late 90s and early O's was an integral go-between for North Korean American relations. So yes, barbecue and North Korea come together in this story. We have, a broad sort of palette of things. We have a trailer on our LinkedIn page if anyone's interested to see this. In that, we have a show idea about people who renovate and maintain classic military vehicles as a way to tell stories about their history and their use in warfare, and also their presence in modern day, and people who have to make parts that they can't find anymore. So the answer to your question is balance. I don't know. I've always liked working. It was a lot tougher when the kids were younger, and now I think that it's something I really enjoy. I mean, I'm really surprised how much I find the cybersecurity insurance part really fascinating. I mean, it sounds crazy to say insurance is fascinating, but the way it matters and the way it affects companies that are well prepared and well protected, in the American economy, I think small and medium-sized businesses, what do they make up? Something like 98% of the GDP that we create. They really, really matter. And I think that there is, to your point earlier, a real vulnerability that they face that, again, could result in a sort of slowdown by 1,000 cuts. So I don't know if I balance it. I exercise, I eat well. I just got a new cholesterol drug. Again, it's a lot like cybersecurity. It's a constant struggle, a constant battle, like to make sure I take care of myself and I take care of my family and my relationships. I probably don't see my friends enough as I used to, but that may not be the case forever. So it's a challenge to be frank, when you really enjoy your work and you find it really interesting to not always want to do it. Particularly because I work from home, my commute's 5 minutes, so it's.
Yeah, I think that in cyber, there's a lot of folks that I've had a couple podcasts talking to educators and such about cybersecurity and people entering the cybersecurity workforce. And there's kind of two different paths that I see now after these conversations. And one is kind of like an occupation path, where people get into cyber because they think that they're going to be able to make money and find a job and do that kind of stuff, and they're kind of on that I'm getting a job path, versus a vocation path, which is like you're passionate about it. It's really interesting to you. And it's almost like an energizing kind of work. And for me, when I hear you talk about this, it's like, the balance is that you're doing something that you love. And as a result, it's less of a challenge to have that work-life balance because it's just part of like what you love to do. And I think that's what I feel about cyber and technology is that I love it. So I can work 18-hour days, no problem. And the only person that gets mad at me is my wife and he coming to dinner late, And so I think
you make a good point, and I think it plays into this is what I've always loved about journalism. And I'm a journalist, right? I'm not an expert in anything, but what 30 years of doing this job at a fairly high level has allowed me is to go places and be there with the people who actually know what they're talking about, whether, it's an embed with U.S. Special Operations in the Southern Philippines or some sort of, Johns Hopkins research laboratory. There's a real privilege in that space. And I also have always loved to learn, and I also love to tell people about things. So I think that there is broadly outside of the cybersecurity, this, it's a really, really interesting way to spend a living, despite the negative reputation it has among a great many people.
Yeah. Well, from your investigative background, what's the biggest misconception you see in how businesses approach cybersecurity insurance?
I think that they think of it, the big thing is that it's still in a lot of minds an IT function. I think it needs to be separate from IT. There needs to be that might help people sort of realize the weight you should place on it. And the analogy I use is if you owned a factory and you had a fence around it and doors with locks, and a lock broke and there was a hole in the fence and you called maintenance to fix it, you wouldn't call that a security operation. That's a maintenance operation. And that's what IT does, right? They update things and they repair computers and they bring people new equipment and they swap out the old one for the new one and help them get logged on or whatever it might be. And I think security is a much different mindset, where, if they repair the camera at your factory, is the wire to the place where it's monitored working properly? Is the person who's at the monitoring site trained to notice things and that sort of stuff? So I think that idea that it's a new thing. And one of my partners wrote he was a U.S. Army Special Forces officer. And after 9/11, he wrote a textbook about integrating terrorism into local law enforcement. And the analogy he used is, local cops are already busy. Their pie of life is full. And we now have come along after 9/11 with this new piece of pie is it a meth lab or is it an anthrax lab? And they have to fit that pie into their existing already full day. And I think that's one of the barriers that people just need to break down and get over. But the cybersecurity is its own thing. It's its own function. And it's also, again, I keep using this word, I apologize. It's holistic. Every employee, just like you would expect them to turn the lights out or lock the door if they were the last to leave the office on a Friday, every employee is a function of security. So maybe even the idea that cybersecurity is just security, given the way we do so much business in the digital space and the technical space now, the way that the supply chain works with, software as a service and all these, you don't have a lawyer in your office anymore. You send files to them over some secure device or whatever it might be. That mindset that this is not a new thing. This is an old thing that just looks a little different and comes with a new bill, unfortunately.
Yeah, it just feels different, right? It just, where you're applying the practice is just a different space, right? It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, we've been using, in cyber, we've been using military and physical security analogies, I think the entire time I've been involved since like 2003. So it's very much just part of how we do business, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, a lot of the people in the business come out of the military. So and there's as many acronyms in the military as there are at cybersecurity. So there's those two very like-minded things. But I agree with you. I mean, I think the analogy I use for MFA is it's an apartment door with a deadbolt and another lock. It's two locks, two keys. Yeah. That's it. That's MFA. It's that simple. You lock them both. You unlock them both to get in. That's it. It's just, you have to use your phone and it's, I remember when I first introduced myself to MFA going back, I don't know how many years it is now, it was confusing to me and no one was explaining it. No one had a way to explain it. It was, I think it was Apple maybe introduced it first. And you get this quick pop-up with another code and one of your devices. And I was like, what is going on? Why can't I get into my iCloud?
Right. Well, I think that's where, your background kind of helps. It's like finding something that's common that everyone knows and helping them see like what the relationship is. Because it's really not magic.
No.
It's just a matter of applying, practices that we've been doing in many other spaces just to, what you do on the computer. It's so very similar.
And again, given how much time we spend on our screens, there's a real opportunity to make it like you're in. It's not like you're not in this space. It's not like you're only using your iPhone for a few minutes a day to make a phone call. Nobody makes phone calls on them, right? Well, they do, pardon me. But my point being that we're in these environments all the time, and we're not secure in these environments. And I think that most people, if it's explained to them, they start to think differently. The problem is changing your cyber resilience and creating a cyber resilient personal life or business environment is like, if you're 35 and you've just gone to the doctor and you've been living a little hard and he's like, well, your cholesterol's high, you got to lose 30 pounds, your heart's not looking great, and you have to go on an exercise regime that becomes your regime. It's not a temporary thing. And I think that is, again, a challenge. It's in some respects, it needs to be treated as a lot to ask if you want to really consider human psychology. It's not nothing to ask people to do all these things. And I think that idea from the company point of view is really, really important because employees are busy. At least they seem to.
Yeah. And definitely from, I think your example, your medical example is kind of true as well, is that I think that when people do the right things and they have the right kind of program and they're actually executing on their security program, it's actually very boring and very mundane. And, and from a CISO perspective, I definitely want that I want it to be boring and mundane, but it takes everyone to kind of, do the right things and know what the right things are to do so that we can have a easy, less risk kind of environment that we're working in. But it does also take IT and the processes that slowed people down, because a lot of shadow AI, shadow SaaS, and shadow IT kind of reasons are just because people are trying to be productive, get their work done before they get their 6:30 bus back to their weekend. Getting those things done, when those things are create friction, then you tend to have lapses in security. So there's somewhat of a balance on making sure you understand like what your members of your community that you're supporting as a cyber professional, how is it that you're going to make it as friction-free as possible so that you get the program running the way it's supposed to be running, not people circumventing your controls.
And we do these check-ins with the largest staff. I think the most direct reports I ever had was 16, and we do check-ins with them about all sorts of things. How do you do it? How's work? Maybe they had a personal issue they brought you. You ask them about it every couple of months or whatever it might be. The idea that cyber security needs to be in that conversation as well. How do you feel about this new log-on tool or whatever it might be? And it's like, oh man, it takes me 5 minutes longer. Well, you as a boss, you need to know that it's going to take someone 5 more minutes to get into a system that they need to get into every day. And time is money, right? That's never changed. And I think that those sorts of practical realities, because we know when these products, to your point about get sold, they get sold with the highest level of promise. And then when the practical reality comes in and you have a broad range of technical knowledge and even IQ and the ability of people to learn new things, it's very, very different in the real world, which is, again, not a problem. It's just the truth. It's the way life is. There's always these challenges. So again, it becoming part of the conversation as not just something you do once a year in the case of cyber insurance or any insurance, but quarterly, or, if you get a new logon method, like now 2 weeks from now, check in with everyone. Let us know how it's going. And that should come from HR. It should be, again, like something that is enterprise-wide so that its importance is made clear from that perspective. This should be the leadership is about delivering often bad news and difficult messages. CEOs should be taking this on. I know CISOs are C-suite, but we read all about how they have trouble getting the CEO and the board to pay attention. So maybe this will help.
Absolutely. To wrap up, what advice would you give to other media professionals looking to pivot into specialized technical coverage like you've done with cyber insurance?
As always, everything takes way longer than you're going to think. I spent the first year trying to learn acronyms, and then I just gave up, and I have a list that I just keep adding to every time I see a new one. I think that I would encourage people to do it, because not unlike we hear that there's no local news anymore, and like local news is going away. And I know a few friends who sort of left national news and gone back to Ohio or Texas, and they're doing quite local news now. And my hope is that helps to display to the public the value of journalism. What happens at your school board meeting is really, really important. Right? We hear way too much about what happens in DC, in my opinion, right? There's really, really important things happen on the local level. So that idea that you can really sort of laser focus yourself on something and find, the challenge is always to find a story or a way to explain how it impacts people's lives in a real way on a regular basis. And so I would just say, be patient. It's been very, very hard for me to learn everything. And even now I have this imposter syndrome, sort of like I'm just faking it, which is exactly how I always feel as a journalist. Because I learn a lot about something. You become sort of a mini expert for 6 weeks or a month to do a documentary about Hamburger Hill. And then you move on to the one about the B-24, and you learn all about the B-24 enough that you could carry on a cocktail conversation, and someone might think you were an aircraft engineer unless they asked you a really technical question. So again, be realistic, be honest. That's the big word in journalism. We need to be more honest. We don't know everything. We can't always tell you the truth. We can tell you honestly what we learned, and I would just go forward with that sort of mentality.
Martin, thanks for being on the Be Fearless podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having me. I hope I had something worthwhile to say.
Lots worthwhile to say. Thanks.
All right. Cheers.